thank you to the panelists who kindly accepted to share their views and in this particularly difficult time that we are in after the war started in Ukraine. And we all realize that, of course, it's a major impact, a major event with world impact, but it has specific impact on the Middle East. As you know, our partner, METO, and GCSP have been working together with other partners to promote arms control in the Middle East, WMD free zone, promote various aspects of both national security and human security. And we realize that this war also can have major consequences on prospect for peace and security in the Middle East as well. And that's why we invited some experts from the region to tell us what their positions are, their takeaways, their analysis on the various aspects of this question. As we know, there have been some attempts for mediation between Russia and Ukraine by Israel and Turkey. There may be an impact on the negotiations about the revival of the Iran nuclear deal, and we know that at least one aspect actually related to sanctions against Russia was one of the obstacles to the conclusion. Now, apparently this has been solved, but there are other issues still pending. We can see that there's been some hesitation by some Arab countries to join the sanctions advocated by Western countries. Of course, most countries in the region have relations with Russia, either on the positive side, with very close strategic ties like Iran, but also Israel. And of course, there may be major impact, major consequences on the oil and gas markets because of the sanctions against Russia. And the question is, of course, pending for some Gulf countries, whether Arab countries or Iran, whether they can substitute these exports of oil and gas from Russia that will not take place. And also possible impact on food security in the region. Some countries like Egypt are being extremely dependent on imports of cereals from both Russia and Ukraine. So for all these reasons, we're very happy to have this opportunity to have this conversation and really count on the expertise, the knowledge, the analysis skills of our experts. We will start for no particular reason, that is just the order of the program, with Dr. Ali Fathollah-Nejad from Iran and Germany, who works in Berlin. He, of course, has, you have access to his biography, a lot of expertise and research on Iran and its relations with countries in the region, and also more specifically the negotiations on the Iran nuclear deal. So Ali, what do you think about this question and the impact of the war on Iran and in particular on the JCPOA?
Thank you so much. Merci bien, cher Marc, for the kind invitation, and I'm very glad to be with you today. Also seeing, dear colleagues from METO. And so what I'm going to do in the next few minutes, I'm going to just share some ideas along the questions that you've posed. And I'm not sure if I'm going to be able to touch upon all relevant dimensions, but I'm going to try to do so briefly. I think, first of all, we have to acknowledge that when it comes to Iran and Iranian perceptions of Russia's war on Ukraine, there is a huge gap between regime and society relations. At the societal level, there is immense skepticism about the role of Russia that is nurtured historically, as Russia has played an important role also in the modern history of Iran, and Iran has lost significant territory, mostly in the Caucasus, to Russia at the time when Iran was quite weak. So all this memory is still very much there, and it was somehow revitalized over the question of Russia's role in the Iran nuclear negotiations in the last 1 or 2 decades. This skepticism that is also shared by some of the policy circles in Iran is based upon basically Russian opportunism and Russian interest to keep the flame of the conflict between Iran and the West alive, because it would be hugely counterproductive for Russian interests if we saw a normalization of relations between Iran and the West. And the one major threat from a Russian perspective was always the threat of Iran energy sanctions removed, so that potentially Russia's energy monopoly over Europe would witness a competitor. Yet, despite beyond the oil issue, I think there are also political issues here that drive Russia's interest not to be interested in a kind of normalization of relations between Iran and the West. And as I've put it in a recent article, this may be the normalization of relations between Iran and the West would be a much higher risk for Russia than a nuclear Iran, because Russia as well as China have been able to benefit politically but also geoeconomically from this Iran-Western conflict. Of course, sticking to state society views on Iran, what we've seen is that the bulk of the Iranian media taking over the Kremlin's propaganda narrative about its war on Ukraine, and with the Russian ambassador giving a press conference in Tehran urging the Iranian media to engage in some kind of Gleichschaltung, one could say, in terms of using the word military, special military operation instead of invasion and war. But this press conference, which, by the way, the Chinese ambassador did in a similar fashion a year or so ago, created also some backlash within the policy circles. And also specifically, Russia's attempt to hijack the talks at the very end, of the JCPO process, which was believed to be the very end of the JCPOA process, by connecting the sanctions that were imposed upon it by the West with Iranian-Russian cooperation in the wake of a restored JCPOA. But somehow the Russians have backpedaled from this strange demand. They've been asking for a written guarantee from the United States, which they later on alleged such a thing was obtained by them. So they somehow backpedaled, and I'm not sure. I'm not sure about all the reasons here. But I think part of the reasons may be this kind of backlash that also existed within Iranian policy circles, that feared that Russia could again, play a role that is more attuned with its, or that is really, ignoring Iranian interests. And then there was also, some kind of, because this goes back also to some Iranian concerns over Russian behavior during the JCPOA process also a decade ago, that was verbalized by former Foreign Minister Zarif in a leaked audio file, last year, where he also raised concerns about the role of Russia at the very end of the last negotiation round that led to the 2015 JCPOA. So this also revitalized those concerns about Russia's, in particular, Russia's behavior in the JCPOA process. But after all, the Russians backpedaled from this demand, as I said, and perhaps because of the backlash that they saw even with pro-Russian elements within the Iranian establishment, potentially fearing a reduction of its political capital there. And secondly, perhaps contemplating about the possibility of using an Iran free of sanctions to circumvent their own crippling sanctions regime. So this may be, two of the points that have, driven Russia's backpedaling on this kind of hijacking attempt. As a last comment, I'm going to just mention something that goes beyond, Iran-Russia dimensions, which is, I think, will have, an impact on the behavior of authoritarian states, non-Western authoritarian states worldwide. And this, I would fear, would materialize in the event of a Russian victory over Ukraine. And I think that a Russian victory over Ukraine would embolden, such non-Western authoritarian powers who, share the idea, as Tehran and Moscow do, about Western weakness. And this is a very important calculation from Iranian and Russian decision makers, as far as I can tell, when driving their own strategies, when driving their own foreign policies. They would not expect a robust answer from the West. And this, I think, can be witnessed, on various, on multiple levels of operation. And I think that if we're going to end up with a Russian victory, this might not be a good signal for the future. So I'm going to stop it here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ali, for outlining the complexity and the ambiguity of this strategic relationship between Iran and Russia. Sometimes in the West, we have this sort of simplistic idea that it's that Russia can dictate its position to Iran, and its action in Syria is completely coordinated with Russia. So apparently this is more complex than it appears. So thank you for that. And now I can ask Lina Arafat from Jordan, how Jordan positions itself in this new situation. Of course, Jordan can be affected by the energy crisis, because it is an importer of energy, and also by the food crisis. And it's been trying to keep good relations with all the actors in the region and the big powers. So, Lina, as a former Jordanian diplomat now working with METO, what is your takeaway?
Thank you very much for giving me this opportunity to speak on this important topic, and I will also cover a little bit on the impact on the Middle East as well. The Russian presence in the Middle East, will take on a new meaning in the context of a conflict that reflects Russian desire to have strong influence in its immediate and broader neighborhood. It will also have consequences on the energy sector in the Middle East, where in view of the crisis, United States could seek its partners Saudi Arabia and Qatar to expand energy supplies in Europe. People in the MENA region, of the Middle East in general, are feeling impacts of this war in Europe on their food security, energy prices, and job markets. They are torn between sympathizing with Ukrainians fleeing their homes and cities destroyed by Russia's weapons, and remembering how the world looked away as the same weapons were destroying Syria, Libya only a few years ago. Meanwhile, regional governments, including US traditional allies, are hedging their bets between Russia and the US-led Western camp, playing on time to better evaluate the impacts of the war and to ease the restraints it's imposing on fragile economies and social fabrics in the region. The way we see it is that this war is impacting the Middle East in three principal areas. First, politically, the crisis has not yet forced any significant readjustments. However, long-term sanctions on Russia will be challenging for Middle Eastern countries whom have been diversifying their defense industries and seeking greater cooperation with Russia. Secondly, there are also increasing concerns over the humanitarian aid and food security in the region, especially in an already fragile countries. The growing number of Ukrainian refugees in the ballooning cost of the post-conflict reconstructions are raising concerns that critical humanitarian aid may be diverted from the Middle East and North Africa to address the fallout from the Ukrainian conflict. For millions of Palestinians, Lebanese, Yemenis, Syrians, and others who live in countries experiencing conflict, economic meltdowns, and increasing humanitarian needs, this would be equivalent to shutting down critical life support. As Russia, considered the larger exporter of wheat in the world, and Ukraine, the fifth largest, and between them, there are around 50 countries that depend on them for 30%. Several Arab countries are also buying more than 60% of their wheat from the two countries. Russia and Ukraine also count for 75% of global sunflower and seed oil production. This also raises significant concerns about or around food security, especially in countries which rely on Russia and Ukraine for their wheat supplies. Countries are looking for solutions, but even if importers seek to replace Russia and Ukraine, they will face multiple challenges in looking for an alternative source of wheat supply. The third element is that the future of gas and oil supplies is critical. Europe will likely seek to build up alternative gas supplies, and therein lies an opportunity for Gulf and Eastern Mediterranean countries. The Gulf countries are currently gaining from the increase in oil prices and are leveraging their situation to renegotiate their strategic relationships to pursue political gains. This may also encourage Middle Eastern countries to spend up some agreements on promising gas supplies with the hope of becoming a key partner for Europe in the future. This development is perhaps most important geopolitically for countries in the Middle East. Oil producing countries in the region, most notably Saudi Arabia, have been forced in recent years to adopt long-needed economic reform measures to move away from retired economies and welfare state model. Oil importing countries will also be severely affected, while high oil prices will pose further risks to already dire economic conditions. Some of these challenges were mitigated in the past through grant made possibly by oil-producing countries. It is not clear whether such grants will be reassumed as political alliances have shifted, plummeting some oil-importing countries like Jordan into increased economic risk. The Jordanian diplomacy avoided any mention of Russia as the aggressor in the conflict. While Jordan cannot publicly assume neutrality over the crisis, it seems that this is what its diplomacy is hoping to achieve. But the longer this war continues, the more pressure there will be to make on its position more clear. The Russian-Ukraine conflict has been a global crisis from day one, and it will definitely affect and impact Jordan like any other country in the region. There will be direct and indirect effects on the economic situation in Jordan in several respects, such as food security, energy costs, and supply chains. Although Jordan imports from Russia and Ukraine mainly grains and oils and does not exceed 7%, but the impact depends on the weight of Russia and Ukraine in export markets. Jordan will also face inflation rates, production rates, and energy rates, which in turn will affect several vital sectors such as the tourism and transportation sector. But this is where I see, or some of the diplomats and politicians believe that this is the opportunity for the Middle East to turn this challenge into opportunities. From the repercussion of the crisis with Russia and Europe's greatest exposure to Russia as a major source of energy and fertilizers, Europe turned to its allies in the Middle East to build partnerships and fertilizer factories distant from the European market. For example, there are some European companies in the process of setting up giant factories in Jordan, where raw materials are abundant, especially phosphate, and to get rid of the dependence on Russia, which has been boycotted politically and economically, of course. The sign that the crisis will not stop with a ceasefire because of the political gap is getting greater than it's containing it as well. Jordan is qualified to be an incubator for these investments because it is politically an ally of the West, and therefore the political risks are non-existent. It is an opportunity for the Jordanian economy, and at the same time, an opportunity for Europe in terms of investments and politics. The benefits expected from these companies approaching the Middle East in such times are many, the most important of which is access to large European sources of financing, as well as benefiting from advanced European technology in terms of water-saving production and production process and high expertise at the highest technological level, as the advanced technology will be transferred to the Middle East. This is a time where Middle East countries should consider the necessity of replacing imports from other countries, diversifying energy resources, in addition to cooperation between industrial and trade sectors for the growth of national economy and maintaining financing programs for economic sectors and food security networks. Importance of developing different scenarios to deal with the effects of the crisis on the region, reconsidering the costs of energy and investments, in addition, and relying to local production, developing an agricultural strategy that is capable of producing wheat and grain in sufficient quantities to satisfy the domestic demands. To conclude, the surge of the prices of on the current inflation could replicate a scenario similar to the Arab Spring, when those factors also played a significant role in aggravating the trigger for civil unrest. Although global food security was unstable even before the conflict due to a rising number of crises and the COVID-19 pandemic, the Russian-Ukraine war will impact many people's lives in the Middle East region. Furthermore, the current international political scene has confused many countries in the Middle East. Most of them have diplomatic and economic ties with both the West and Russia. Thus, they find themselves involved in the division of the conflict and are trying to find a balance to avoid setting up and spoiling relations with either party.
Thank you very much, Lina, for this very detailed overview of the consequences of the Ukraine war in the region, and particularly in Jordan. Of course, what's interesting that you also raised potential opportunities or impact, in a positive impact in sense of policy shifts towards less dependence on foreign suppliers of energy or food products, which is actually one of the conclusions that is being drawn also in Europe vis-a-vis Russia, potentially also Ukraine. So the trend may be actually to join forces, and as you clearly said, there are common interests. Perhaps also to become less dependent on fossil fuels. So that would be also a consequence that would perhaps improve the way to address the climate crisis and protection of the environment. Most likely these trends would be medium or long term, but it's interesting that we need such a crisis perhaps to accelerate some of these changes. And also, a very important point that you mentioned is the potential impact on societies and social unrest based on your previous experience of the Arab Spring. So that will be very interesting to watch, and in particular in countries where there was this instability or vulnerability already. Thank you very much. And now we move to Ambassador Karim Hagag from Egypt, who's both a diplomat and an academic teaching at the American University in Cairo. And Karim, obviously, you are in a country which has been also directly affected by the immediate impact of the war, which also tried to maintain good relations both with Russia and the West, which is also a large importer of military equipment, a lot, of course, coming from the United States, France, but where probably Russia has been also trying to promote its own arms exports. So how do you see the role of Egypt and its potential influence on other countries in the region?
Thank you, Marc, and thank you to the GCSP and METO for the gracious invitation to join with you in this very important discussion. So let me address the potential impact on Egypt, but in a broader regional context, which is what I would like to focus on. Because I think the implications of this conflict for the region as a whole I think will be very interesting to observe. But first, a caveat is in order. These are early days with respect to the conflict. I think what we are looking at, it seems to be the first stages of what will likely be a very protracted conflict. And therefore, the global repercussions, including those with respect to the Middle East, will play out over time. So I think much of what we can say is still tentative and really raises more questions than answers. So let me try and address some of these questions that I think will be very relevant in the short and medium term with respect to the implications of this conflict on the region. First, I think it's very important to look at the regional political response and the implications for the strategic relationships of regional actors with both Russia and the United States. Now, Lina especially has touched, I think, very clearly on this issue of diplomatic hedging. And it's true, what we have seen in terms of the regional response is not so much any geopolitical realignment in terms of the regional response to Ukraine, but we have seen much diplomatic hedging. And this has been reflected in the voting patterns of regional countries in the UN General Assembly and also in the Security Council. It's also been very clear in the diplomacy of certain regional countries vis-a-vis this conflict. And I think that hedging is, of course, an understandable reflection of the tendency not to expose their position diplomatically vis-a-vis a very sensitive international conflict. But I think more importantly, it reflects the degree to which the strategic relationships between the United States and its regional allies have been fraying over time. Now, this pertains especially to the Gulf states in particular, but it also pertains to varying degrees with respect to Egypt, Turkey, and even I would say with respect to Israel as well. And these strategic relationships are gradually being replaced with a very diverse array of commercial, political, and in some aspects, strategic relationships between regional states and other great powers, namely, in this case, of course, Russia, but also China as well. So for Israel, this means a reliance on Russian acquiescence to continue its military operations against Iran in southern Syria. For Gulf countries, it relates to their relationship with Russia in the context of OPEC+. Qatar as well is a partner with Russia as co-members of the Gas Exporting Countries Forum. For Egypt, it includes, as Lina mentioned, a reliance on Russian wheat exports, tourism. The suspension of tourism revenues have hit the Egyptian public finances particularly hard. It also involves a very close relationship with Russia in the civil nuclear realm. I mean, Russia will be providing Egypt with 4 nuclear reactors. This is a very significant and large-scale deal between Egypt and Rosatom. So you see this wide array of relationships that countries in the region now have to balance in terms of these conflicting interests between Russia and the West. Now, this does not mean that regional states are willing to sacrifice their strategic relationships with the United States, but it is a reflection of the degree to which these strategic relationships have been strained over time. Now, this is, of course, a trend that preceded the conflict in Ukraine. And I think the key question is whether the war in Ukraine will accelerate this trend or force a recalibration that leads to shoring up America's strategic partnerships with its regional allies in the Middle East. And so that really is the first key question that I think we should look very closely at, whether the continuation of this conflict will accelerate a pre-existing trend of the fraying of these relationships over time or lead to something different. Now, related to that is, I think, another key question of Russia's role in the region. And here, I think this is still an open question as to how the conflict will affect Russia's role in the Middle East, because we are looking at different possibilities. I mean, one possibility is that the war in Ukraine will gradually weaken Russia's position as the conflict in Ukraine proves to be a drain on Russian resources. So we can see a diminishing of Russia's leverage in conflict zones such as Syria, especially, and Libya, potentially, as resources are devoted more and more to the war in Ukraine. But we could also see the opposite outcome. And the war in Ukraine can potentially consolidate Russia's regional presence, especially if the war actually leads Russia to attach greater value to its military and diplomatic assets in the region. For example, we can see a potential situation in which Russia looks to its air and naval bases in Syria, not just in terms of Russia's power projection in the Middle East, but to the extent to which these assets are now linked to Russia's overall defense strategy, linking the Mediterranean to the Black Sea, for instance. And this, I think, is an especially salient point in light of Turkey's decision to close the Bosphorus and Dardanelles to Russian warships. So I think that the potential role of Russia in the Middle East, that as it will be affected by this conflict, is still an open question. A related question is the potential repercussions of this conflict on regional conflicts in the Middle East. Now, Ali has talked, I think, very clearly about how the negotiations over the JCPOA were somewhat insulated from the broader conflict with Ukraine, overcoming this potential hurdle of Russian sanctions with respect to the implementation of certain aspects of the nuclear deal if we do have a restoration of the JCPOA. So that was one potential silver lining, in that it sets a very important precedent of how the necessary diplomatic cooperation with respect to these conflicts can be insulated from the broader war in Ukraine. But we also have to ask whether this is actually applicable to other conflict zones. especially with respect to Syria and to a certain extent Libya. And the key question here is whether the necessary diplomatic cooperation can actually be sustained in what is or what are essentially very fragile peace processes. So we see that certainly in Syria with the constitution writing process. We see that in Libya in the context of a very tense situation in which we have, once again, two rival governments vying for legitimacy in the Libyan context. So it's an open question whether the necessary diplomatic momentum between the West and Russia can be sustained to support these fragile peace processes in the region. And that, of course, touches on the longer term question of whether potentially the Middle East itself will become an extension of an arena of the conflict in Ukraine, and whether the war in Ukraine escalates to such an extent that both parties actually target their respective interests of the other side in the region. Whether Russia decides to weaponize issues such as refugees and other aspects of the conflict in the Middle East as a reflection of the escalation in Ukraine, or whether the Middle East as a conflict arena will be insulated from the war in Ukraine. Finally, I think there's a very interesting question related to the effects of this conflict at the level of global order, and how and what implications this has for the Middle East as a whole. I mean, one very salient aspect of this, I think, is the potential use or threat of use of weapons of mass destruction in Ukraine. We have the first allegations of chemical weapons use in Mariupol that are now being under investigation. We had, of course, the implicit threat of nuclear weapons with Russia's decision to raise its nuclear alert level. And we had accusations and counter accusations of bioweapons labs in Ukraine that have been raised in the all the way up to the United Nations Security Council. So the proliferation effects in critical regions, including the Middle East, I think will be extremely important to watch. And I think it's very interesting how the calculus with respect to issues such as acquisition, sanctions, deterrence with respect to weapons of mass destruction, I think will be under consideration by certain countries, not just in the Middle East, but also outside of the Middle East. I think it was very interesting to watch or to observe the call by former Japanese Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, calling for a debate on Japan's reluctance in terms of nuclear sharing with the United States against the backdrop of Ukraine. So I think the potential proliferation effects, I think, will be one issue to watch. I think, again, speaking on the level of global order effects, the whole issue of sanctions, which Lina mentioned, and the increasing weaponization of sanctions. And sanctions, I think, on this order of magnitude is something that we have not seen really since the end of the Cold War. I mean, the region has been subject to various levels of sanctions. We have the situation in Iran, we have the situation in Syria, we have the situation with respect to various terrorist groups, but sanctions on the global level that have been applied with Russia will have very significant consequences for the region. And the ability of the region to actually cope with these sanctions will, I think, be a very critical question. And compliance with sanctions, or obversely, a tendency to circumvent sanctions if the economic pain becomes too much, I think will also be something very interesting to watch. I think that the double frame applied by the West to this conflict, I think will again be very interesting to see how it affects politics in the region. So we've seen the West frame the conflict in Ukraine in two ways. First, as a defense of the rules-based international order and international law, but also as a conflict between democracies and autocracies. And Ali mentioned this point, I think, very ably, framing the conflict in this way, whether it will have political repercussions on the relationships between the West and certain regional states, I think will also be very interesting to watch. So you have at the global order level implications at with respect to the strategic aspect of this conflict, but also I think the economic aspect and also the normative aspect, I think will be very interesting to watch. So forgive me for raising more questions than answers, but let me stop here and turn it back over to you, Marc.
Thanks very much, Karim. I think it was a very good geopolitical approach, a strategic approach, which goes much beyond the impact of the war in the Middle East. And you're right to raise these issues such as the risk of proliferation, because we know that, and this is one of the main purposes and actions of METO and what GCSP has been supporting, how to make the Middle East free of all weapons of mass destruction. So when you see these allegations or threats of use, or the fact that a country with nuclear weapons can feel this form of impunity, preventing any reaction, feeling protected by its nuclear weapons, that also could have a proliferating effect, could inspire countries which feel insecure and encourage them to acquire nuclear weapons. So it's really a global issue. Thank you for raising this. And now we move to Sharon Dolev, who will tell us more about the Israeli perspective. Of course, Israel also has a very complex relationship with Russia. Of course, it's very close strategic ally of the US, but has a large population diaspora from a Russian origin, and the Israeli Prime Minister has attempted some mediation. Apparently, there is no unanimity, even in government, about how to relate to Russia in this conflict. So, Sharon, can you enlighten us more about these complexities?
I'm afraid not, Marc. Thank you very much. Just like Karim, I was hoping Karim, usually when Karim speaks before me, and usually when Karim speaks, he gives the answers and I bring the questions, and he didn't notify me that he doesn't bring any answers. I have also much more questions, also because I'm not here representing the Israeli side, but as a director in METO, my concerns. Karim said it's just the beginning, and I fully agree with him. This is an unfolding situation, but it is an unfolding situation that is one brick in a very long way of the superpowers game inside the Middle East. I mean, it's not something where even, I mean, if there was one thing I would think we should learn from this, is that the superpowers game playground in the Middle East was not in the benefit of the Middle East. And I think that this is something we all already know, but until there's peace and unity in the Middle East, we can't do much about it. But it's a long, long game. Russia and the US are trying to divide the Middle East between them, just like UK and France did in the past, a bit more successfully. I guess it was more, there was more clarity then. But if it's a beginning of something, and as an activist and not an academic, I'm looking forward and I'm looking at what should I worry about. And the things that I'm worrying about are, and sorry to sound hippie, is lack of faith. I mean, one of the things that hold society as we know it is the belief in some rules, is the belief in the international power of the international law, in some standards. Now, we saw a beginning of lack of belief, not just with the war between Russia and the Ukraine. we saw the beginning of the lack of belief when Trump administration removed US from a working agreement, the JCPOA. And now there's another block when Russia is behaving differently than we expected it to behave at the beginning of the new round of the JCPOA. This is one thing. The second thing is states that rely on the superpowers to protect them from within the Middle East, states within, and I am talking now mainly about Israel, but Israel is not alone there, looking at the US and the NATO abilities to stop Russia in the Ukraine. And I guess this is also another huge damp in the belief that we are somehow protected just by association. Which means that states in the Middle East will need to start looking at other guarantees. And the question is what these guarantees will be. And when I'm talking about the lack of belief, I am looking very much at the upcoming November conference. Will we see the states from the Middle East and Iran sitting in the same room with the four superpowers? The US won't be there, Russia will be there. At the first meeting of the states, Russia's support at the November conference, at the UN conference on the zone, was a bliss. Is it now the same bliss? I mean, one of the superpowers that actually supports the zone is now, I'm not trying to take sides, but the vast majority of the world is the villain. How will this affect the November conference? I think that the states in the Middle East are looking at this hesitance of the US and NATO, and they need to readjust how they are dealing with Russia. But I'm looking at also at Israel and Syria, and the fear that that Israel won't be able to operate in Syria the way that it is, and the fear or the look or the way that the media and other states are reacting to the fact that the NATO and US reaction seems like a weak one, means that diplomatic means look like weak procedure in answer to power. And that worries me even further, because that makes me think that people might think that diplomacy is weakness, while asserting power is the only thing that might work. And how will that affect the Middle East and the future talks in the Middle East? Another thing that I'm looking at, what will a new order in the Middle East will look like, and how it will play effect at the November conference. Because right now, what we see in the November conference is the Arab states and Iran actually working in a way that we never expect them to work together. And this is a miracle by itself. And I wonder if this will continue, how will it look like? But just like Karim said, this is a beginning of a process. But the only thing that, I mean, the real big change was that up till now, it was all diplomacy, most of it. It was all diplomacy, and now it's power, and we're looking to see how this game will leak into the Middle East, and there's not much we can do about it. Just notice and see, and hope that it will not affect the November conference as such. And of course, before the November conference, we're going to have the NPT, and before that, the TPNW, but the big game will be at the NPT, and we'll see how states will react to that, and how will a review conference will look like, will look at it. I think that one of the beliefs that was shattered, and this is a dangerous belief to be shattered, is nuclear deterrence. I think that the minute that in the Middle East, we saw Russia threatening with nuclear weapons, even though they didn't say it directly, it was very much understood that this is the threat, and the way that the US and NATO cannot do much against this reaction might cause some states in the region to believe that nuclear weapons are the only deterrence, are the only protection, and is the only way to do whatever you want with no one answering you. And this is a threat to the current situation in the Middle East. And I want to say something that is much more an activist, humanist. I think that one of the things that we're not discussing here, because we're talking about weapons of mass destruction, is children in the Middle East are dying by the thousands every week. And they do not get the attention that Ukrainians are. And I hate counting dead bodies. It is appalling in my eyes. But my worry is, we see what happened in the Ukraine. We see how much people care about the victims of the war in Ukraine, and yet there's not much that can be done to assist and help them. What does it mean for states in the Middle East if they're under attack? I am afraid of more extremism because of it. I'm afraid of, on one hand, more games of the superpowers in the Middle East, because in order to be a superpower, apparently you have to have some kind of game in the Middle East. And thank God for, or thank not God, but the wisdom of Karim and Lina that shared, and Ali, that shared the economical interest in the Middle East. But my fear is the lack, and again, I'm going to it, the lack of belief in the international system, in diplomacy, and in the ability to receive help when we will really need it. How will that cause the states to behave? And I'm sorry to leave with just questions and observations, but thank you very much.
Thank you, Sharon. Of course, these are very legitimate questions that we are all asking ourselves. And certainly your conclusion about the powerlessness, or the feeling of failure, collective failure of the international system, of the Security Council, and the lack of solution to all these conflicts also in the Middle East, their instrumentalization, their exploitation for great power politics. This is, of course, something that we have to share. Now, of course, I've read a lot of reactions from various sources and various quarters, but also from the Middle East. And it's true that sometimes you read this reaction of double standards, and saying, what about the invasion of Iraq by the US, another nuclear power, feeling completely powerful and with no risk of retaliation by any nuclear power, especially in this particular case. And actually there are two cases in the Middle East where nuclear weapons programs have been dismantled in Iraq and in Libya, and after that those countries have been invaded. So again, the message certainly is still very vivid in people's mind. Now, of course, double standard is a reality, but it cannot serve as an excuse for the invasion of Ukraine and all the other destruction. So thank you for raising these points. Before, we might already see a few questions in the chat, but before opening the floor for more questions, I can maybe just quickly go back to each of you with one particular question that I may abuse my position to ask first. Ali, of course, we're all looking at what's going to happen with the JCPOA. There's been some optimism that was about to be concluded. Now it seems to be again in some state of limbo or stalemate. This is of course very closely related to the issue of delisting the Iranian Revolutionary Guard Corps from the terrorist list that apparently the Biden administration was going to accept, but of course there are internal very strong pressures for Biden not to do that. But apparently for Iran, that would be the last condition to allow for the resumption of the JCPOA. So what's your analysis on that?
Thank you, Marc. So I'm going to respond to your question. If you allow, I'm going to say, an additional note after that. Actually, to be honest, I'm not sure if any of those issues are really the sticking points. I mean, especially the one on delisting the IRGC from the US Department's Foreign Terrorist Organization list, which is, even the Israelis acknowledge, of a symbolic value. And it would not change anything on the sanctions regime that already exists against the IRGC because of various reasons. So, and then again, about 10 days ago, there was, the Iranian foreign minister appearing on Iranian TV saying that senior commanders of the IRGC had told him to go ahead with the conclusion of the deal, regardless of the IRGC issue. But nevertheless, the IRGC issue is, of course, important because it is such a dominant player in the economic field in Iran. So sanctions against it will be important, but I'm not, sure if this precise FTO thing is something. Of course, it would, it creates the political controversy. It is, in the United States itself. There is mounting bipartisan pressure against the Biden administration to delist them, and it seems that it has worked. But be it as it may, and I think the Iranians are again now calculating that currently they're now in a position of strength, so they can, wait and see. And continue with their nuclear escalation strategy in order to gain more concessions from the Western side. So this seems right now to be the Iranian calculation. But regardless of what will happen, a restored JCPOA Obama era will basically produce the same results that we've seen a decade ago, which is not pacifying regional geopolitics, but sustaining tensions in the region. And this is a very unfortunate kind of conclusion. And I think we have to be realistic here, and also about the use of the economic dividends that Tehran might, get from the deal, and where it's going to be investing it, in of course, strengthening its position at home, given tremendous also pressure from below, but also for power projection. The ballistic missile program is a huge component of the current budget of President Raisi. So I think, I really doubt, and I've argued in the past that we should have extended the talks beyond the nuclear deal. So I fear that we're going to see just a déjà vu and a very short-term kind of perhaps deal. The Iranians will benefit from it economically, but the socioeconomic dividend in Iran will be the key question, and not some GDP growth figures in terms of Iranian domestic, appraisal of that or not. If I may add another point in challenging one of the things that Sharon has said, and which is, the issue of diplomacy. I think, of course, diplomacy is always important and is a, indispensable feature to avoid any kind of confrontation in the international system. But the particular case of Russia's invasion of Ukraine shows the downsides of, sticking always with diplomacy. We have a heated debate now in Europe, separating the continent basically between Eastern European, populations and experts, and those especially in Germany, who are accused of a quasi-appeasement policy vis-a-vis Putin's Russia over the last decade or more. And I think there is even ground to say that such a claim is not really far-fetched. If we look at Germany's Russia policy over the last decade and more, and the paradigm, of what we call, seeking change through trade and rapprochement, Wandel durch Handel, and all of this has collapsed. I think there is, this debate is still ongoing, and it should be much more vociferously discussed in Europe. I'm sure it is discussed in Europe. It should be more vociferously discussed specifically in Germany with the current elite of the Social Democrats, who have been a major proponent of such a policy, of thinking that they could, they could somehow, through economic integration via Nord Stream 1 and 2, one could avoid any kind of scenario that we are now seeing playing out today. Secondly, I think we have to have a more realistic understanding of the ideology of autocracies and to take them seriously. And, I know a lot of Russian experts, have warned about such an invasion much before I myself, understood the relevance of it. But simply looking at the kind of discourse emanating from Putin and the Kremlin over the years. So I think, the same is true, and I would argue the same, deficits in understanding the other side is true when we look at the kind of debate we have had vis-a-vis Iran. So it has, it was based on the same kind of paradigms, and it is a lot of wishful thinking from the European side, and potentially also very much driven by business interests, but. All of that, at the end, I would argue, would potentially be not of a long-term solution or not sustainable. So I think we have had, a lot of people in the policy circles having pursued this particular strategy of somehow integrating and somehow talking and, relying on diplomacy. But we have not to be fooled, because the other side, doesn't, perhaps perceives diplomacy in a different way. This is also important to understand. So diplomacy per se, I would argue, is not, per se a good thing to follow. I think what we need is some robust stances along with diplomacy. I'm not talking about necessarily military postures, but to be blunt and to talk about things that are controversial, be it when it comes to domestic issue of human rights violations, but also on expansive regional policies. And the West has been, and particularly so, Europe has been silent over consecutive, wars of aggression by Putin's Russia, in the Caucasus, Crimea, and nevertheless, the Germans were continuing business as usual. And so I see a tremendous gap in the security debate that we now have in Europe between Eastern Europeans who are highly frustrated about not only the past, but also the existence or the perseverance of this discourse in the present, despite the German government's announcement to have engaged in a Zeitenwende, in an epochal change, and that would transform German security and foreign policy totally. I think so. There is still a lot of frustration about about the questions whether countries like Germany have really learned the lessons, and I think this is something that we can also apply to policies vis-a-vis some of the Middle Eastern states. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Ali. So I will refrain from asking other questions because we already have a few in the chat, and Pablo will read out those.
Yes, thank you, Marc. We have two questions from Sarah and Nada for Ambassador Haggag. The first one concerns China, and Sarah asks, I'd like to hear Mr. Haggag's assessment on China's increasing agency in the Middle East, which is becoming more and more multipolar region. Can diplomatic hedging turn into something more serious in the future? So that's for the first question. And for the second question, it concerns what you said before. So whether the Russia-Ukraine war disregards and perhaps undermines all the non-proliferation and disarmament efforts made by the international community. So both questions are for Ambassador Haggag. Thank you.
Thank you. Very quickly, the question on China is we've seen greater engagement by China in the region, mostly on the commercial level, but also increasingly on the geo-economic level. I mean, the extension of the Belt and Road Initiative to the Middle East has forged some very interesting relationships with countries such as Egypt, such as Israel, moving into the Eastern Mediterranean as well. So I think you will see, I think, an acceleration of that aspect of Chinese diplomacy with respect to the region. What we have yet to see is an overt interest on the part of China to assume a greater security role in the region. So we've seen a tremendous reluctance as of yet to assume any overt security burden in terms of issues such as Gulf securities, for example, security of oil supplies, a strong role, a strong Chinese role with respect to conflict resolution efforts in the region. I mean, we have yet to see that. I mean, China has basically maintained its diplomatic approach in the context of its role in the UN Security Council, but we haven't seen, for example, any robust Chinese mediation effort in any of the regional conflicts. And so it remains to be seen whether China's growing economic and commercial role in the region will develop into something different. I think countries in the region are certainly looking for alternatives to their over-reliance on the United States and the West for their security. And they may be looking to China, but as of yet, we don't see any Chinese willingness to play such a role. On the issue of non-proliferation regimes, I think this is a very important aspect of the conflict in Ukraine. You know, if we go back to the beginning of this year, right, January 3rd, so the first working day of 2022, we had this remarkable development of the P5 statement on nuclear proliferation. And for those of us who follow these things, you know, getting a P5 statement on anything is really a big deal. But we had this statement by the P5, the permanent 5 members of the Security Council, in which they basically said that nuclear weapons will not be a part of the conflicts, any potential conflicts between them. And this was a very positive statement. Now, we went from that high note to basically 2 months later, we had the UN Secretary General reference the Russian decision on nuclear alert and calling this a bone-chilling development. And I think that's just a snapshot of the seriousness of the potential consequences that this conflict poses for non-proliferation regimes. I think a very important question, and I think I'm aligned with Sharon on this, is to what degree the non-proliferation regimes will be able to cope with this type of stress. So, for example, will there be a constructive and positive role for the OPCW in investigating chemical weapons, claims of chemical weapons use in Ukraine? You know, because that will really be a litmus test as to whether these regimes can succeed in containing the proliferation fallout effects of this conflict or not. Just a final word on this, I think it's very, there's also a very important arms control component to this crisis. I mean, if we look at the pre-war diplomacy, between Russia and the NATO alliance. And the draft treaty that was published by the Russian Foreign Ministry that they demanded the United States accede to, and the US counter proposals to the Russian draft treaty. Arms control was a very big part of this. And in both the proposals and counter proposals, we had very serious approaches to dealing with issues such as the demise of the INF treaty, the undermining of the original 1990 CFE treaty, the Conventional Forces in Europe treaty. The hope is that if there is a diplomatic settlement to the conflict in Ukraine, arms control will likely be a big part of that. And hopefully that might set a positive precedent for the revival of arms control approaches in the settlement of these types of conflicts. Thank you, Marc.
Thanks very much. And there's another question that perhaps we could ask Sharon and Lina.
Yeah, so the last question from Rebecca, one of you can answer it. So do violations of international agreements and norms, including international humanitarian law, NPT and others, mean that treaties don't work, or that the UN and the current international power structures need to be transformed and strengthened to implement, enforce, and hold violators to account? And if the latter, what needs to be done?
Lina, would you like to? Okay.
Sharon, go ahead.
Thanks. Well, thank you for this question, Rebecca. Well, I think that treaties are not supposed to work or not work. Goodwill is supposed to. Now, treaties, as you, Rebecca, taught me, are only as good as the states that, or the parties that are signing and their goodwill or good faith. The NPT is a treaty that I know that now when we have the TPNW, some of us need things that needs to be discarded. The TPNW is a treaty that lacks good faith, that's for sure. It starts, we may talk a lot about the 1995 resolution. I'm talking about, of course, the resolution for the Middle East that lacked any goodwill, because how can you promise something that you can't deliver? And yet it was promised. Not enough was done in order to fulfill this promise. I mean, yes, lots of talks, but not much was done in order to fulfill this promise. And yet the NPT is still holding. So there is some power to the NPT. And before we discarded it or throw it in our past, because we have the TPNW now, I want to remind all of us, and this is where I'm going to be a bit optimistic, even though I didn't start it optimistic. The NPT is also the only place where the 5 nuclear powers have committed to disarm with Article 6 of the NPT. And if we as civil society, academics, people that represent states that do have some responsibility, if we want to do something, and this is something that the Middle East Treaty Organization, METO, is going to call for at the upcoming NPT in our campaign and in our advocacy is, and we hope that as many of you will join us, is for a timeline. Just because there's a nice article in a nice treaty doesn't mean that anyone is working or doing something. And yes, it is up to us. I mean, if we want treaties to work, we need to give them the energy and the faith and the work to give them power, or else it's just papers. We think that it is time to stop hiding behind the bush, stop just, sorry, not hiding behind the bush, but stop ignoring the nuclear powers when it comes to nuclear weapons. We think that now that the TPNW is there, multiple non-nuclear states have joined. Now it's time for all these states and for us in civil society to sit and demand one thing. We need a timeline for Article 6 of the NPT. Article 6 calls for the disarmament. The other 4 states, will have to join. And in METO, what we're doing, the work for WMD Free Zone Treaty, this is something that is being done. And this is another, I mean, we're working on a treaty. It's just a paper. But at the end, if the states in the Middle East will join or agree on something that Israel can join, then Israel will be able to be one state with a solution or original solution in order to disarm. It doesn't mean that Israel will do it. But if at the same time we will call for the other states to do something, to move forward, to reduce the threat, to remove nuclear weapons or warheads from the missiles, from the her trigger alert missiles, and so on. This is the campaign I think we should all push for, especially after the Ukraine war. This is how we insert energy in and power into existing treaties. I hope I answered the question.
Yes, thank you, Sharon. Lina, what do you think about this?
To add to what Sharon said, and in terms of, whether respecting the treaties signed by the states, if there's any violations, there's also another element that, the states should also consider and respect, which is the international humanitarian law in times of crisis. When treaties are not being respected or being violated, states are also obliged to respect all the provinces of the international humanitarian law as well, and to practice this in times of crisis, in respect for the humanity, for all those who are not part of the conflict, are not taking part in the armed conflict as well, but for the civilians who are, they cannot defend themselves. Crises have great impacts on mainly on the civilians, and of course as the armed forces as well. But this is the time where we should emphasize the implementation of the international human law and the respect of its all provinces by the states, by all the parties who are part of the conflict as well.
Thank you. I may also add that actually the NPT is the only treaty, or the last treaty of the Cold War, which gives a veto power to permanent members of the Security Council. All the treaties adopted later, whether it's the Chemical Weapons Convention, the Comprehensive Test Ban Treaty, and the treaties on conventional weapons, such as the Anti-Personnel Landmine Ban, or the Cluster Munitions Treaty, the Arms Trade Treaty, and the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, there is no veto power anymore. And it was a case of Chemical Weapons Convention when Russia tried to block expansion of inspection powers for the organization. It was defeated. It was in a minority. It could not apply a veto. So this is a major trend, I think, and a major aspiration of the international community, which really makes the NPT look like a relic of the old world. So I think with the mobilization of the international community and civil society, we can make this evolve and change, hopefully. There was another question directed to Ali.
Indeed, from Sarah, a second question regarding, maybe you read it already, Ali, regarding the rivalry between China and the Europeans in the MENA region unfolding in the future, especially regarding the recent rapprochements between China and Algeria. So, Ali, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you. So I'm not an Algeria expert, so I'm going to transfer this issue to mentioning what I did not mention at the very beginning. And I mean, first of all, I think, all those, great power relationships with Middle Eastern states have to be analyzed on a case-to-case basis. So I think there are no generalizations really possible. So I'm going to focus, if you allow, on the Iranian case. As you may know, Iran has signed a 25-year so-called cooperation agreement with China last year. And apparently it was, its implementation started this year. With Russia, Iran has also is also planning to strike a long-term deal, a 20-year deal, also labeled as, in the case with the deal with China, as a strategic kind of partnership or cooperation. But importantly, both contents are totally unknown. no one knows about the contents of both deals. Hence, there is wild speculation about the possible ramifications of it, of both deals. And also, a tendency of opposition to those deals, because there is, the fear that Tehran, because of unprecedented domestic and international pressures, domestically, the protests over the last few years, and tremendous crises, and what I've labeled for Karim's Cairo review as a triple crisis of socioeconomic, political, and ecological crisis, and externally because of the huge pressure by the United States. So there is a fear that the regime may be engaged in a kind of selling out of national interests, of national resources, to both, both Russia and China, in return for their support on the international political and diplomatic arena. And so I'm going to just, stop at that. And if you're interested, I've mentioned some of the controversies between Iran and, or within a potential Iran-Russia deal in a recent piece for the Middle East Institute. Things that are, widely debated in Iran, but as I said, we do not know about the contents of the deal, which is not a positive sign at all, of course.
Thank you very much, Ali. And we are approaching the end of our webinar. So I may just turn to each speaker, but in the reverse order, and ask them maybe to say a few concluding remarks. So Sharon.
Well, first, my concluding remarks are thank you very much, Marc, as always. It's a pleasure to have a webinar with you, and thank you for all the speakers. I think that this is time for us to see what it is that we can do in order to support the one process that we know that is working and is working by far better, I think, and I hope that the other speakers will say something about it, maybe about the November conference, the UN conference on the zone. I think that if you hear about what's happening in the room and the intersessional work, I think that there's one process happening that is going by far better than we thought, and therefore it is up to us, the states that are supporting this, to protect it. This is what we have in our power, and how do we protect it? There's intersessional work. We can do our own intersessional work. METO is planning a series of roundtables, very small ones, very closed ones. If you like to be part of them, of course, we will be happy to see who can join us. We're going to support by writing as many papers as we can on the different thematic areas of the draft treaty, or the treaty that will become the Treaty of the Middle East. And we have the TPNW coming up, we have the NPT coming up. We can meet in person probably for the first time in a long time. And one thing needs to be said very clearly. There is a process in the Middle East, it needs to be protected. This is the way to bring the states from the Middle East to the table, and we need to do whatever we can to minimize the bad influence of the superpowers on this process, because this process shows one thing: the states in the Middle East, even though Israel is absent, are very capable of solving very complicated issues, like a weapon of mass destruction free zone. The first zone ever to be created is going to be created in the Middle East. And this is something that we can do, and we can do it much better if the superpowers are not part of it.
Thank you very much, Sharon. Next, Karim.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you, Marc. And thank you to all the speakers. I very much enjoyed your comments. I would really echo what Sharon mentioned. I think when it comes to the proliferation aspect, the W&D aspect of this conflict, which I think is very salient, I think one very interesting observation is that much of what we are talking about has already happened in the Middle East. Right? So chemical weapons use, we've seen a very extensive, unfortunate precedents of that, going all the way back to the Iran-Iraq war, the conflict in Iraq between the government and the Kurds, most recently in the context of the Syrian civil war. We've seen on the level of the nuclear proliferation, what we're seeing is aspects of hedging, especially with regards to enrichment capabilities and fuel cycle capabilities. So I think that the potential for the Middle East to exacerbate what we might potentially see in the context of the war in Ukraine, I think is very significant. I mean, the Middle East will be a very critical arena in terms of whether we are able to reinforce the existing but fraying non-proliferation norms, or whether we will see a further undermining of these norms. So I think that there you can see a connection between the Middle East and the conflict in Ukraine. And I would just really echo what Sharon has already mentioned, that we need to keep our eye on the ball with respect to the proliferation spillover effects of this conflict with respect to the Middle East.
Thanks very much, Karim. Now, Lina.
I, third or second my voice with Karim and Sharon. Definitely, this is a time where all diplomacy efforts have to be made, and following moderate diplomacy. Middle East, as I said in my input, this is a chance where we can take this crisis, take all these challenges and turn it into opportunity for the Middle East. We have seen crises before. We know what's it like. We know the impact on the civilians as well, and we know what it does to countries. So we have to seize every diplomatic effort that it's possible in order to solve this, resolve this crisis in the best and peaceful ways, in terms of respect for the civilians, for the humanitarian issue as well. And again, I would emphasize how the Middle East can take these challenges and turn it into opportunities and make the best out of it as well.
Thank you very much, Lina. And finally, Ali.
Thank you. I have nothing to add. I just learned a lot from the other contributors, and thank you so much for having me.
So thank you to all our panelists. I think it was a very interesting and important conversation to be had at this juncture. And my main takeaway, I think, will be to share your concerns and your hope that diplomacy and international law will be withheld, sustained, made the solution to these conflicts, both in the region and in Ukraine. So with that, thank you to all our participants for their patience, for their interest and their questions. Thank you, Pablo, for your help, and hope to see you on a further opportunity. Take care.